$70. The auctioneer's voice carried across the freight platform. Sold. A man laughed. He laughed loud, and he laughed long, and he made sure everyone heard him laughing. His name was Harlan Beck. He stood 6'2" in a new gray suit. He weighed more than 280 pounds. He had a red face that caught the depot lights like a barn on fire. 12 men stood on the platform. They laughed because Harlan Beck laughed. That is the way a crowd does. Calvin Hatch did not turn around. He stood at the back of the crowd with his hands in the pockets of a blue depot coat he had worn for 31 years. He wore it because it fit him. The coat was faded to the color of a winter sky. It had a torn right pocket. His left hand held a paper receipt. His right hand held nothing. The object sat on a folded canvas tarp at his feet. It was a steel safe. Cast iron. 18 inches tall. 14 inches wide. 96 pounds. Black when new. Now the color of old brake dust. There was a placard tied to the handle with hemp twine. Sealed, 1943. Department property. Calvin Hatch saw one thing nobody else saw. A small scratch above the dial. The kind of mark a station man makes when he is sealing something he does not want opened by strangers. He had seen that mark 3,000 times. The bidding had ended. The crowd was leaving. The depot lights buzzed above the loading dock at 4 minutes before 6 in the evening. The temperature was 41 degrees. A north wind came down the railbed. It smelled of cold iron and pine resin. Calvin Hatch lifted the safe with both hands. Calvin Hatch was 64 years old. He stood 5'9" and weighed 178 pounds, and he had not weighed that since 1949. The years had thinned his wrists and thickened his knuckles. His hair was the color of cut hay. His eyes were gray. They moved the way a good station man's eyes move, slow on purpose, missing nothing. He had been a station agent for 31 years. He knew every sealed room and every locked cabinet in 3 counties. He knew which doors were painted shut and which were nailed shut and which were shut because the man who shut them meant it. He had locked freight rooms for the Greenfield Depot. He had locked the ticket vault. He had locked the safe where the cash and the train orders lived. He had done so under the instruction of his father, who had been a station agent before him. His father's name was Roy Hatch. Roy had worked the Greenfield platform from 1908 until 1944. Roy had taught his son that a lock is not a wall. It is a conversation. Roy had said it the first time a boy of 14 had put his hand on a station dial. Roy had said it the last time he worked a shift in 1944. Roy had died in 1957 with a brass key still in his coat pocket. Calvin Hatch no longer worked for the railroad. He had been let go in 1959 when the depot closed. He now collected what was left behind. He drove a 1953 Chevrolet pickup with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked only when the truck was parked on a hill facing south. He bought back what the company sold off. He did this for no reason he had ever explained to anyone. He did it because he had learned a long time ago that a building does not forget. Only people do. The safe sat in the truck bed. He drove home at 32 miles an hour. He did not pass the speed limit. He had never once in his life passed the speed limit. Harlan Beck was 52 years old. He ran what was left of the Greenfield rail operation. He sold off what could not be moved. He bought new trucks. He wore suits that did not fit him well. He had a voice built for telling other men what to do. He had not earned his place at the railroad. He had married into it. His wife's uncle was the regional superintendent. He had worked as a grain elevator clerk in 1952. He had worked as a used car salesman in 1955. He had worked as a deputy sheriff in 1958. By 1961, he was running the Greenfield Rail office. He had not learned the difference between a freight manifest and a waybill. He had one redeeming habit. He tipped his hat to widows. He did it without fail. It did not save him. When the bidding for the sealed safe reached $14, Harlan Beck stepped to the front of the platform. He looked at Calvin Hatch. He called him the depot ghost. He called him the lock picker from bad years. He said, in front of 12 men whose names he did not know, that the old man had paid $70 for a box of rust, and he hoped the old man ate his rust for supper. The 12 men laughed. They laughed because the loud man laughed. They laughed because they did not know who Calvin Hatch was. They laughed because that is the way a crowd does. Now, if you have ever seen a man who knew exactly what he was doing get laughed out of a room by a man who did not, subscribe to this channel. Because the people who stay for stories like Calvin Hatch's are exactly who abandoned government buildings discovery was built for. The Greenfield Depot had been built in 1899 by the Plattsmouth and Western Short Line. It was a clapboard freight depot. It had a tin roof that rang when it rained. It had a platform long enough to load 7 cars at once. It had a wood-burning stove in the corner of the agent's office. The stove gave the room the smell of cut pine and old coffee. The safe had been installed in 1912. It had been ordered from a Mosler safe company of Hamilton, Ohio. It was rated for 2 hours of fire. It weighed 96 pounds. It had lived in the corner of the agent's office from 1912 until 1943. 3 station agents had locked it and opened it. Calvin Hatch had locked it himself in 1941 when a shipment of railway bond certificates had arrived from Kansas City. It had been sealed on March the 11th of 1943 by a man named Luther Marr. Luther Marr was 38 years old. He stood 5'7" and he had one eye that looked slightly to the left. He had worked the Greenfield platform since 1929. He was a quiet man. He had a wife named Ada and a daughter named June who was 6 years old in 1943. On March the 11th of 1943, the United States had been at war for 15 months. Luther Marr had received his draft notice on February the 26th. He had reported to Fort Leavenworth on March the 8th. He had come home for 3 days to say goodbye to Ada and June. He had come to the depot on the morning of March the 11th, and he had locked the safe with his own hands. He had put inside the safe 4 things. He had put inside the safe his wife's wedding ring. He had put inside the safe a letter he had written to his daughter. He had put inside the safe $240 in war bonds he had bought at the post office. He had put inside the safe a small ledger he had kept since 1929, listing every freight shipment he had logged. He had locked the safe. He had given the key to Calvin Hatch. He had said, "Do not let anyone open it until I come back." Calvin Hatch had never opened it. Luther Marr had been killed at Anzio on March the 22nd of 1944. He had been 39 years old. Ada Marr had been told by telegram on April the 8th of 1944. June Marr had been 7 years old that spring. 21 years had passed. The safe had sat untouched behind a locked door inside a depot that had gone quiet. Calvin Hatch had taken a key from his own coat pocket on the 12th of April in 1944, and he had put it in a tin box under his bed, and he had not looked at it again until the 17th of October in 1964. That is 21 years and 193 days. He loaded the safe into the bed of the 1953 Chevrolet. He did alone. The safe was 96 pounds, and his right knee had given him trouble since the spring of 1962, and he had to lift with his thighs and not with his back. He set it down carefully on the canvas he had brought. He drove home at 32 miles an hour. The road from the Greenfield platform to his house was 11 miles of chip seal and 4 miles of gravel. He stopped once at the 4-way stop in Redfern. A man named Doyle Pratt stood under the gas pumps. "You buy that old safe, Calvin?" Doyle said. Calvin Hatch said, "I did, Doyle." "Go to get open?" Doyle said. Calvin Hatch did not answer. He had been asked a thing he had not yet been asked by himself. He pulled the truck into the gravel drive at 22 minutes after 6. The temperature had fallen to 36 degrees. A dog barked twice at the Pine Ridge place 3/4 of a mile south. The safe sat in the truck bed. He let it sit. He went into the kitchen. He ate 2 pieces of bread and a boiled egg. He drank a cup of coffee out of a white mug that had a chip on the rim. He went out to the garage. The garage was a wood frame building his father had built in 1927. It had a concrete floor and a workbench of yellow pine and a single 60-watt bulb that hung from a wire at the center of the ceiling. He pulled the string on that bulb. He pulled up the wooden stool he had built from oak scraps in 1948. He set the safe on the workbench. He set a square of cardboard under it so it would not mar the pine. He laid out on the bench, left to right, his tools. A brass-handled screwdriver from 1938, a flat wrench of 1/4 inch, a can of 3-in-1 oil, a small hammer with a worn handle, 4 picks of his own, making with handles of cherry wood, a pen light, a pair of reading glasses he had bought at the 5 and Dime on a Thursday in 1959. He sat on the stool. He put the reading glasses on. He looked at the dial. The dial was a 4-tumbler dial of the kind Mosler had shipped in 1912. The numbers were black on a brass face. The numbers were the small kind that required a man to lean in close. The brass had gone the color of a winter pond. He set the first pick. He turned it. The first tumbler did not move. He turned the brass handle of the second pick. He turned the wrench. He sat back. He thought about Luther. He thought about the morning of March 11th of 1943. He applied the oil. He applied it slow from a glass pipette. He waited. The oil ran down into the mechanism, and the mechanism had not tasted oil since 1943, and the oil took its time. He waited 11 minutes. He sat with his hands in his lap. He thought about Luther's left eye that looked slightly to the left. He thought about Adamar, who had moved to Omaha in 1946. He thought about Junmar, who would be 27 years old by now. He set a second pick. He turned it. A tumbler fell. A second tumbler fell. The dial gave a quarter-inch of play he had not felt in 21 years. He turned the wrench. He heard sound. The sound was small. The sound was like a man clearing his throat in the next room. He sat back. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He set a third pick. He turned it slow. He thought about his father saying that a lock is not a wall. It is a conversation. He turned the pick the way Luther had turned the same handle on the morning of March 11th of 1943. He felt the conversation begin. The third tumbler fell. He turned the handle. The handle did not turn all the way. He tapped it once with a small hammer. He turned the handle again. The handle turned. The sound was small. It was not a bang. It was the sound of a man setting down a glass he had been holding for a long time. The door opened. The air that came out was cold. The temperature inside was 51 degrees. The smell was old paper and cold metal, and the smell of a folded cotton handkerchief that had been pressed flat against a wedding band for 21 years. Calvin Hatch did not reach in. He sat on the stool. He sat and looked for a long time. He did not know how long. He reached in with his right hand. He took out what was on top. $240 in Series E war bonds. March 1943 issue. He laid them on the bench. He checked each one twice. He set them down in order. He took out the ledger next. The ledger was a black composition book. The cover was cracked along the spine. He opened it. The first entry was dated June the 14th of 1929. The last entry was dated March the 10th of 1943. He laid the ledger beside the bonds. He took out the wedding ring. It was a plain band of yellow gold. It weighed 3 grams. It had a wear mark on the inside from a finger that had worn it since 1928. He laid it on the cardboard. He reached in last. He took out a folded piece of cream stationery. The paper was heavy. The envelope was addressed in a careful hand. The address read, Junmar, care of Adamar, RFD2 Greenfield, Nebraska. The postmark was blank because Luther had never mailed it. He unfolded the letter on the workbench. He sat on the stool. He read it in silence. He read it twice. He did not speak for 9 minutes. The bulb above the bench buzzed softly. The dog at Pine Ridge had stopped barking. He sat with the letter in both hands. The key line of the letter read, June, when you are older and your mother has told you about the morning I left, you will know that I was thinking of you at the depot. I was thinking of your hands. You had the smallest hands in the county. Your hands will be the last thing I see. Your father, Luther. Calvin Hatch folded the letter along its old creases. He put the reading glasses in his shirt pocket. He stood up from the stool. His back ached. His right knee complained the way it always complained when the weather was about to turn. He went into the kitchen. He made a second cup of coffee in the white mug with the chipped rim. He did not speak. He had never been offered a reward for a thing like this, and he would have been embarrassed by either response. Calvin Hatch drove to Omaha the next morning. He arrived at the house of Adamar at 22 minutes after 8. Jumar answered the door. She was a woman of 27. She had her mother's hands. Calvin Hatch set the ledger and the wedding ring and the letter on the kitchen table. He said 4 words. He said, "From your father, June." He drank a cup of coffee. He drove home at 32 miles an hour. Harlan Beck heard the news at noon from a man who ran a hardware store in Redfern. He heard about the war bonds. He heard about the letter. He did not speak about it for a long time. By the spring of 1965, Harlan Beck had been relieved of his position. The railroad sold the lot. He moved to Kansas City. He had not been heard from in that county since. The town of Greenfield voted in November of 1965 to make the depot a museum. The safe sits on a square of oak in the corner of the agent's office. Children touch the brass dial. They ask what it is. The guide tells them it is a locked conversation. The guide says it has been a locked conversation since 1943. Calvin Hatch went back to work the same week. He drove his 1953 truck. He bought another sealed safe in April of 1965. He bought another in 1966. He did not speak about the Greenfield Depot. He did not speak about Luther Marr. A letter does not die when it goes undelivered. It waits. What would you have done that morning? Would you have kept the ring for yourself? Or would you have driven 11 miles of gravel to a kitchen table and said 4 words to a girl who had waited 21 years for her father's voice and never received it?